From a robot powered by fetal brain tissue to Harvey Keitel's entire voice being replaced by another actor, Saturn III is one of the strangest sci-fi disasters ever made. This 1980 film starring Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett featured a legendary director who'd never made sci-fi, a screenwriter who turned the nightmare production into a celebrated novel, and a 63-year-old leading man obsessed with proving his virility through frequent nudity. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Saturn III. Fact 1. Harvey Keitel's entire performance. Was dubbed one of the strangest things about Saturn III is that you never actually hear Harvey Keitel's real voice in the entire movie. Every single word spoken by his character, Captain Benson, was completely redubbed by British actor Roy Dotrice, who adopted a clipped mid-Atlantic accent that sounds nothing like Keitel's distinctive Brooklyn tone. This wasn't just a few lines here and there, it was Keitel's entire performance from start to finish, making it one of the most extensive dubbing jobs in Hollywood history. The reason this happened depends on who you ask, but the most commonly accepted story is that Keitel simply refused to return to Shepperton Studios in England for post-production looping work. Director Stanley Donen wanted Captain Benson to have an upper-class veneer to make him appear more threatening and sophisticated, but Keitel's natural Brooklyn accent didn't fit that vision. Some sources suggest that producer Lou Grade had a falling out with Keitel during filming and demanded his voice be replaced, while others say Keitel was so unhappy with how the production turned out that he wanted nothing more to do with it. Roy Dotrice, a respected British actor known for his work in Space 1999 and later Game of Thrones, was brought in to salvage the situation. In interviews years later, Dotrice himself seemed baffled by the decision, pointing out that both Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett were American actors with American accents, so singling out Keitel for replacement made little sense. The result is a vocal performance that sounds strangely monotone and disconnected, almost like watching a poorly dubbed foreign film. Ironically, this oddness actually enhances the creepiness of Keitel's already strange character, giving Captain Benson an even more unsettling quality than originally intended. Keitel's biographer later called Saturn III the nadir of his career, and it's not hard to see why when you consider that audiences never even heard his actual performance. Fact 2. The robot cost. Over $1 million. Hector, the killer robot at the center of Saturn III, was one of the most expensive elements in the entire production, and for good reason. Standing over 8 feet tall, this mechanical monster required an absolutely massive team just to make it move on screen. A crew of 20 people worked offstage during filming, each handling different radio controls to operate Hector's various body parts, because the robot was so complex that no single person could manage all of its functions at once. The construction process was incredibly labor-intensive and time-consuming. Special effects supervisor Colin Chilvers and his team spent 2 years perfecting Hector before the robot was ready for its close-up, and the final price tag came to just over $1 million. That represented roughly 10% of the film's entire $10 million budget going toward a single prop, which was an enormous expense for 1980, especially for a movie with only 3 main characters. Part of what made Hector so expensive was that the production didn't build just one robot. They actually constructed multiple versions of Hector because the robot kept wearing out during filming. They had many outer covers or shells, and each of the robot's arms was built separately with its own dedicated team of technicians operating it. Some sequences required someone to actually get inside the suit, while other scenes relied entirely on radio control and external manipulation. Director Stanley Donen later admitted they had hilarious problems with the expensive robot during production. When they wanted Hector to pick up a table, everything on the table would slide off and crash onto the floor because the robot had no way to keep the surface level. The robot's thin neck and delicate head were particularly vulnerable to damage and needed constant repair, since the action sequences required Hector to take a real beating through multiple takes. The outside company hired to build Hector had little experience working in the motion picture industry, so they constructed the robot in a way that made it extremely difficult to remove parts and access the mechanical guts inside when things inevitably broke down. Fact 3. Hector was powered by fetal brain. Tissue. One of the most disturbing aspects of Saturn III is the origin of the killer robot's intelligence. Hector wasn't just another mechanical villain in a science fiction movie. Instead, this 8-foot-tall machine was powered by an organic brain made from what the film calls pure brain tissue that was extracted from human fetuses. This bizarre detail was explicitly stated in the movie's dialogue and became one of its most controversial elements. The film explains that Hector belongs to the demigod series of robots, which represents a new generation of artificial intelligence that relies on actual biological brain tissue rather than traditional computer programming. In the story, this fetal brain material is grown in laboratories and then implanted into the robot's transparent cranial chamber, where viewers can actually see the pulsating organic brain inside Hector's metal body. The idea was that using real human neural tissue would give the robot superior learning capabilities and problem-solving skills compared to purely mechanical systems. What makes this even stranger is how the robot gets programmed. Captain Benson, played by Harvey Keitel, has a data port surgically installed in the back of his neck, and he connects himself directly to Hector's brain using a cable. This neural link allows Benson to transfer his knowledge and skills directly into the robot's organic brain through his own thoughts and memories. Unfortunately, because Benson is a psychotic murderer who failed his psychological stability test, all of his violent impulses and sexual obsessions get copied into Hector's brain tissue along with everything else. The film shows the process in graphic detail during an extended assembly sequence where Hector is filled with what looks like red fluid pumping through transparent tubes connected to his brain. The concept raised serious ethical questions even in 1980, and the film never addresses where exactly this fetal tissue comes from or how a society that can barely feed itself manages to maintain such a morally questionable robotics program. Fact 4. The original director died. Shortly after leaving, John Barry was supposed to be Saturn III's director, but the production turned into a nightmare that ended with one of the most tragic outcomes in film history. Barry wasn't just any director, though. He was actually one of the most celebrated production designers of the 1970s, having won an Oscar for his groundbreaking work on the original Star Wars in 1977 and contributed stunning visuals to Superman in 1978. Saturn III was going to be his directorial debut, based on his own story concept that he'd pitched to producer Stanley Donen while they were working together on Lucky Lady in Mexico back in 1975. The problem was that Barry had almost no experience actually directing actors or staging scenes, even though he was a visual genius. According to Donen, he didn't realize just how inexperienced Barry was until filming had already started in late January of 1979. The production quickly began to flounder as Barry struggled with the basics of running a set, and things got worse when he clashed with Kirk Douglas, who apparently made life very difficult for the first-time director. After just 2 weeks of filming, Barry either quit or was fired, depending on whose account you believe, though Donen insisted there was no firing and that Barry left after a dispute with Douglas. What happened next makes the story even more heartbreaking. Barry went back to what he knew best and joined the crew of The Empire Strikes Back as a second-unit director, returning to the Star Wars universe where he'd already made such an incredible contribution. But during pre-production work on that film, Barry suddenly fell ill and collapsed on set. He died of meningitis in May of 1979 at a tragically young age, never getting to see either Saturn III or The Empire Strikes Back reach theaters. Director Stanley Donen later said that only a tiny bit of what Barry shot ended up in Saturn III's finished film, meaning his sole directorial work was largely erased from the final product. Fact 5. Kirk Douglas. Reportedly directed for 2 days when original director John Barry either quit or was fired just 2 weeks into production, Saturn III found itself in a crisis that would have shut down most films entirely. The sets were built, the expensive robot was constructed, and the cast and crew were ready to work, but suddenly there was no one calling the shots from the director's chair. Before legendary musical director Stanley Donen could arrive to take over, someone had to keep the production moving forward, and according to multiple reports, that someone was Kirk Douglas himself. Douglas, who was already the biggest star on set and had decades of experience in Hollywood, allegedly stepped in to direct for approximately 2 days while the studio scrambled to find a permanent replacement. This wasn't entirely unusual for the veteran actor, who had strong opinions about how scenes should be shot and had already been clashing with Barry over creative decisions before the original director's departure. However, what makes this situation particularly fascinating is that no one seems to know for certain whether any of Douglas's footage actually survived into the final cut of the film. Stanley Donen later confirmed that only a tiny bit of what Barry shot ended up in the finished movie, suggesting extensive reshoots took place under his direction. This raises the question of whether Douglas's brief stint as director met the same fate, with his scenes being completely reshot, or if some of his work quietly remains in the film without credit. The production was already chaotic enough with script problems, an inexperienced original director, and a troublesome robot that constantly broke down, so adding an uncredited actor turned temporary director to the mix only deepened the behind-the-scenes confusion that plagued Saturn III from start to finish. Fact 6. It was directed by the Singin' in the Rain director. Stanley Donen's involvement with Saturn III stands as one of the most unexpected career turns in Hollywood history. The man who had directed some of the most beloved musicals ever made, including Singin' in the Rain, 7 Brides for 7 Brothers, Funny Face, and Charade, suddenly found himself at the helm of a dark science fiction horror film about a killer robot on a remote space station. Before Saturn III, Donen had absolutely no experience with science fiction filmmaking, making this genre shift even more puzzling to audiences and critics who knew his work. The situation became even stranger when you consider that Donen wasn't originally supposed to direct the film at all. He had signed on only as producer, with production designer John Barry set to make his directorial debut. But when Barry either quit or was fired just 2 weeks into filming after clashing with Kirk Douglas, Donen was forced to step in and take over directing duties. In a 1980 interview with Starlog magazine, Donen admitted he'd seen Alien just a few weeks before filming began and liked the 1950s Howard Hawks film The Thing from Another World, but he seemed somewhat uncertain about making what he called a terror movie with only 3 human characters. Donen later confessed that the production problems weren't Barry's fault, but his own, saying he hadn't realized Barry knew almost nothing about staging scenes or handling actors, despite being a terrific talent as a production designer. The director also acknowledged the film's unusual challenges, admitting that the $10 million budget was excessive for a movie with just 3 characters, but explaining that the robot cost far more than expected and was much slower to photograph than anticipated. He compared the experience to making a movie in a rowboat, noting how difficult it was to create variety within the single complex where the characters lived. For a director famous for elaborate dance sequences and sweeping musical numbers, the claustrophobic limitations of Saturn III must have felt like working in an entirely different medium. Fact 7. Martin Amis used it to write his famous novel. The disastrous production of Saturn III became the inspiration for one of Martin Amis's most celebrated works of fiction. The acclaimed British novelist, who had been hired to write the screenplay for £30,000, witnessed firsthand the chaos that unfolded on set at Shepperton Studios in England. What he saw during those troubled 15 weeks of filming in 1979 gave him enough material to craft his 1984 satirical novel Money, which Time magazine would later include in its list of the 100 best English-language novels from 1923 to the present. In Money, Amis created the character John Self, a commercial director trying to make his first feature film while dealing with an impossibly difficult cast and crew. The aging film star in the novel, Lorne Guyland, was directly based on Kirk Douglas and his behavior during the Saturn III production. In one memorable passage from the book, the character strips off his robe and asks the director with tears in his eyes, "Is this the body of an old man?" This scene reportedly mirrored real incidents on the Saturn III set, where the 63-year-old Douglas constantly wanted to prove his youthful virility by appearing nude. Amos later confirmed the connection in interviews, telling reporters that Lorne Guyland was inspired by Kirk Douglas, noting that while Douglas didn't go nude for him specifically in the writing process, the actor was always ripping his clothes off on set. The novelist also revealed that Douglas once admitted to the departing director John Barry, "I'm unbelievably insecure," and according to Amos, Douglas was naked at the time he said it. The project that John Self attempts to complete in the novel is similarly racked with disaster, just like the actual production of Saturn III, making the book a thinly veiled account of one of Hollywood's strangest science fiction productions. Fact 8. Kirk Douglas was obsessed with being naked. Kirk Douglas was 63 years old when he made Saturn III, and according to everyone involved in the production, he seemed determined to prove he still had the body of a much younger man by taking his clothes off as often as possible. Screenwriter Martin Amis, who witnessed Douglas's behavior firsthand on set, later said that when actors get older, they become obsessed with wanting to be nude, and Kirk Douglas certainly wanted to be naked during filming. This obsession became so pronounced that Amos used Douglas as the basis for a character in his 1984 novel Money, where an aging movie star named Lorne Guyland constantly strips down and asks people with tears in his eyes if his body looks like that of an old man. The situation became particularly uncomfortable when it came to Farrah Fawcett, who was 30 years younger than Douglas and didn't want to do nude scenes. According to Martin Amis in a 2012 interview, Douglas became adamant about the nudity issue and made shocking statements about his co-star. When told that Fawcett wouldn't take her clothes off, Douglas reportedly responded by saying she was only a TV actress and threatened that he would rip her clothes off himself. This attitude created tension on set, especially since Fawcett had already agreed to appear topless in one scene, which was later criticized as completely gratuitous. The movie features multiple scenes of Douglas either partially or fully nude, including an infamous fight sequence where a completely naked Kirk Douglas wrestles Harvey Keitel to the ground and attempts to strangle him while Farrah Fawcett tries to pull him off. This bizarre scene has become one of the most talked about moments in the film, not for any artistic merit, but simply because of how awkward and unnecessary it feels. Douglas's preoccupation with displaying his physique extended throughout the entire production and became yet another strange element in what was already shaping up to be one of Hollywood's most troubled and unusual science fiction projects. Fact 9. Sean Connery and Michael Caine turned down the lead. Before Kirk Douglas signed on to play Major Adam in Saturn III, the filmmakers had their sights set on much younger leading men who could create a more conventional romantic pairing with Farrah Fawcett's character, Alex. Producer Lou Grade originally hoped to cast 49-year-old Sean Connery as Adam, which would have given the film genuine star power at the height of Connery's post-James Bond career. The role would have presented a fascinating contrast to Connery's usual tough guy characters, showing him as a peaceful scientist living in isolation on a remote moon base. When Connery turned down the part, the production team approached Michael Caine, another major British star who was riding high on his success in films throughout the 1970s. Caine also passed on the opportunity, leaving the producers scrambling to find a leading man who could carry the picture opposite Fawcett. Enter Kirk Douglas, who at 63 years old was significantly older than either Connery or Caine, and nearly twice Farrah Fawcett's age. Douglas was immediately intrigued by the science fiction concept and agreed to take the role, but his casting completely changed the dynamics of the film. The script had always featured an age difference between Adam and Alex, but with Douglas in the lead, that gap became impossible to ignore. This age disparity became even more awkward given Douglas's insistence on frequent nudity throughout the production, culminating in the film's infamous scene where a completely naked Kirk Douglas wrestles Harvey Keitel to the ground while Farrah Fawcett tries to pull them apart. It's fascinating to imagine how different Saturn III might have been with Sean Connery or Michael Caine in that same nude fight scene, or how the film's troubled production might have unfolded differently with a younger, less ego-driven star in the leading role. Instead, audiences got Kirk Douglas at his most determined to prove his virility, turning what might have been a straightforward science fiction thriller into one of cinema's most bizarrely memorable misfires. Fact 10. Farrah Fawcett was paid $750,000 after reading the script mid-flight. The casting of Farrah Fawcett for Saturn III happened in one of the most unusual ways imaginable, and it all took place thousands of feet in the air. Producer Lou Grade was flying from Los Angeles to New York when he found himself sitting across the aisle from one of the biggest stars in America at the time. Fawcett had become a household name thanks to Charlie's Angels, and her famous red swimsuit poster had sold an incredible 12 million copies, making her one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Grade saw an opportunity he couldn't pass up, so he walked across the aisle, handed her the screenplay for Saturn III, and asked if she would be interested in starring in the film. Fawcett read through the script during the flight, and by the time the plane landed, she had agreed to take the role. The entire deal was essentially done before they touched down in New York. What makes this story even more remarkable is the massive pay disparity it created among the cast. Fawcett's mid-flight agreement resulted in a contract worth $750,000, which was an enormous sum for 1978 when her casting was announced. Meanwhile, Harvey Keitel, who had already established himself as a serious dramatic actor with films like Taxi Driver and had received critical acclaim for his work, was cast at a fee of just $90,000. That means Fawcett was paid more than 8 times what Keitel received, despite Keitel having the more demanding and complex villainous role. The salary difference reflected the harsh realities of Hollywood at the time, where box office draw and name recognition meant everything. And Fawcett's star power from television translated into a much bigger paycheck than Keitel's respected but less commercially proven film work could command. Fact 11. Farrah announced her divorce. During post-production, Saturn III wasn't just a disaster on screen, it marked a painful turning point in Farrah Fawcett's personal life as well. After 15 weeks of filming wrapped in the spring of 1979, Fawcett made a public announcement that sent shockwaves through Hollywood. She was separating from her husband, actor Lee Majors, star of the hit television series The $6 Million Man. The timing wasn't coincidental. The troubled production of Saturn III had coincided with the final unraveling of their 9-year marriage. Fawcett and Majors had married on July 28, 1973, during the early days of both their careers, and for a time they were Hollywood's golden couple. But by the time Fawcett signed on to Saturn III in 1978, cracks in their relationship were already showing. The demanding filming schedule at Shepperton Studios in England kept Fawcett away from home for months, and during production she reportedly missed several days of shooting due to what was officially called an illness. However, the real reason for her absences was the emotional toll of her deteriorating marriage. The production itself was a nightmare, with the original director walking off the project, Kirk Douglas making demands about nudity, and Harvey Keitel's difficult behavior on set. Fawcett was dealing with all of this while simultaneously processing the end of her marriage to the man who had been by her side through her rise to superstardom with Charlie's Angels. The stress of both the chaotic film shoot and her personal crisis created a perfect storm of misery for the actress. By the time filming concluded, Fawcett and Majors had made the decision to separate, though they wouldn't finalize their divorce until February 16, 1982. The separation announcement came just as Saturn III was entering post-production, adding yet another layer of bad publicity to a film that was already plagued with behind-the-scenes problems. For Fawcett, Saturn III would forever be associated with one of the most difficult periods of her life, both professionally and personally. Fact 12. Violent scenes were cut by producers' orders. Even though Saturn III managed to earn an R rating in the United States for violence and brief nudity, the film you see today is significantly tamer than what was originally shot. Producer Lou Grade, the powerful British media mogul behind the production, personally intervened and demanded that 2 extremely violent scenes be completely removed from the final cut before the film's release in February of 1980. The first deleted scene was a disturbing dream sequence that showed both Adam and Alex, played by Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett, brutally murdering Captain Benson in what was meant to be a fantasy brought on by the blue dreamer pills featured in the film. This hallucinogenic sequence would have given audiences a glimpse into the psychological toll that Benson's presence was taking on the couple. But Grade felt the content was too graphic and objectionable for theatrical release. The second cut was even more gruesome, and reportedly one of the main reasons Grade stepped in. This scene depicted Hector, the killer robot, methodically dismembering Benson's dead body on a laboratory table after killing him. According to production reports, this sequence was meant to showcase the robot's complete lack of humanity and its transformation into a true monster. But the graphic nature of seeing a corpse being torn apart piece by piece was deemed far too intense. These cuts reduced the film's running time from approximately 103 minutes down to just 88 minutes, removing a total of 15 minutes of footage. Despite Grade's efforts to make the film more palatable to mainstream audiences, Saturn III still received harsh criticism for its remaining violent content, including scenes where Hector cuts off Benson's hand and wears his severed head like a hat. The deleted scenes have since surfaced in various forms, with some restored footage appearing in the NBC television broadcast version and on later home video releases, giving modern viewers a chance to see just how dark Saturn III was originally intended to be. Fact 13. The iconic poster outfit never appeared in the film. One of the strangest aspects of Saturn III's marketing campaign is that promotional materials around the world featured Farrah Fawcett wearing a revealing costume that moviegoers never actually got to see in theaters. The outfit in question was a futuristic leather ensemble with garters that made Fawcett look like something between a space-age dominatrix and a sci-fi pinup. And it appeared prominently on posters from Thailand to Europe, designed to capitalize on her sex symbol status from Charlie's Angels. The scene was actually filmed during production in 1979 at Shepperton Studios in England, and it was connected to a sequence involving the so-called Blue Dreamers, recreational pills that Adam and Alex take to experience vivid dreams. This deleted dream sequence would have shown Fawcett's character Alex in what the production called her coming-out dress, though the outfit was far more provocative than that innocent description suggests. The scene also involved a murder fantasy where Adam and Alex kill Captain Benson, making it doubly controversial for producer Lou Grade, who was already concerned about the film's violent content. According to reports from the production, Grade was so appalled by the violence in the dream sequence that he ordered it removed entirely from the final cut, and the leather outfit scene went with it. Despite this decision to cut the footage for being too racy and violent for the film's intended rating, the marketing department had no such qualms about using Fawcett's image in that very same costume to sell tickets. The irony wasn't lost on audiences who showed up expecting to see that outfit only to find it completely absent from the 87-minute runtime. The deleted scene does exist and has been shown in various formats over the years, including a German-dubbed version that surfaced online and footage that was restored for the NBC television broadcast premiere, where it was reinserted to fill a 2-hour time slot. Shout Factory's Blu-ray release from 2013 also included portions of the deleted scenes as bonus material, finally giving fans a chance to see what all those posters had been promising. Fact 14. Hector's design was based on Leonardo da Vinci. One of the most striking elements of Saturn III was the robot Hector, whose design drew inspiration from an unlikely source, the anatomical drawings of Leonardo da Vinci. Special effects supervisor Colin Chilvers, who had previously worked on Superman, the movie with production designer John Barry, was brought on to create the film's practical effects, with Hector being the centerpiece. Chilvers based the robot's humanoid form on Da Vinci's famous anatomical sketches, which studied human musculature and skeletal structure with scientific precision. The result was an 8-foot-tall mechanical being that looked both futuristic and oddly organic at the same time. What made Hector truly unsettling was that he didn't have a traditional head. Instead, the robot featured 2 mechanical eyes mounted on a stalk that protruded from its shoulders, giving it an almost insect-like appearance with perfect peripheral vision. Even more disturbing was the large, visible organic brain at the robot's core, which pulsed with what the crew called cyber blood during the activation sequence. The brain was made from actual human fetal tissue according to the film's plot, which added another layer of horror to the design. The robot's body combined smooth metal plates with exposed veins and arteries, creating an uncomfortable blend of machine and living tissue that looked unlike any other robot in science fiction at the time. Building Hector was an enormous technical challenge that took 2 years to complete. The production actually constructed several versions of the robot because the suits kept breaking down and wearing out during filming. Each arm was operated separately by different teams of technicians using radio controls, and there was occasionally someone inside the suit as well. The robot's delicate head and thin neck proved particularly fragile and constantly needed repairs after being knocked around during action sequences. Director Stanley Donen later admitted that photographing Hector took much longer than expected, contributing significantly to the film going over schedule and over budget. Fact 15. The film's budget suffered. Because of Raise the Titanic, Saturn III had the misfortune of being produced at exactly the same time as one of the biggest box office disasters in film history. ITC Entertainment, the British production company run by media mogul Lord Lou Grade, was simultaneously funding 2 massive productions in 1979, Saturn III and Raise the Titanic. This dual production strategy would prove to be a catastrophic mistake that ultimately doomed both films. Raise the Titanic was an ambitious adaptation of Clive Cussler's best-selling novel about raising the famous shipwreck from the ocean floor. The production quickly spiraled out of control, going massively over schedule and hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. The film's budget ballooned far beyond its original estimates, and it became clear to executives that they had a financial disaster on their hands. When Raise the Titanic finally limped into theaters, it bombed spectacularly, earning only $13 million against its estimated $40 million budget. Lou Grade himself later joked that it would have been cheaper to lower the Atlantic Ocean than to make the movie. As Raise the Titanic consumed more and more of ITC's resources, Saturn III paid the price. The production budget was slashed, forcing the filmmakers to cut corners and scale back their original vision. What had been conceived as a lavish science fiction thriller with elaborate sets and effects had to be trimmed down significantly. This financial constraint affected everything from the number of shooting days to the special effects budget, hampering director Stanley Donen's ability to realize the film's full potential. The budget cuts came at a particularly bad time, as the production was already struggling with the departure of original director John Barry and tensions between the cast members. With less money to work with and mounting production problems, Saturn III never stood a chance of becoming the groundbreaking science fiction film it was meant to be. The combined failure of both films contributed significantly to the eventual collapse of Lou Grade's filmmaking operations.